I'm Alexis Jones, and this is a lesson on how to change the conversation.
What is your earliest memory of being creative?
I love questions on the spot where you have to be like, I am not prepared for this. Okay, I was 9 years old. I was super passionate about having a Siberian Husky in Texas, which makes zero sense. And I put together like this entire, my mom references this all the time. She was like, you put together this entire like presentation for her, and I like landscaped how I was going to take care of this dog. And needless to say, she still said no, but I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, I was like drawing pictures of where the dog was going to live and all the things. And that was the first time that kind of this creativity of like bringing together this vision of something that didn't yet exist and would never exist. However, I would say that was the first time that I really kind of like leaned into, you can come up with something inside of your brain that doesn't exist in the world, and you can work towards making that happen.
It's a vision board. You're a vision boarding early on.
Major.
So many aspects to your business. And I don't know if you consider yourself a brand, but I Am That Girl. What was the inspiration for I Am That Girl, and when was it born?
It was definitely born around 19 years old. And I think for a long time, I had these really eloquent answers during interviews where I was like, I just really cared about girls and women. And I think it took me getting older to recognize the truth that it's not that I wasn't being truthful in that response. It was just the realization as I got older that I created I Am That Girl because I needed it. Like that was the most honest answer, was that I grew up a poor kid in a rich kid neighborhood, and I had a whole lot of insecurities about that. And then I got a scholarship and I moved out to sunny Los Angeles, California, going to USC, University of Spoiled Children. And all of a sudden, all of those insecurities were, on
magnified.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And I was part of a sorority, which some of my sorority sisters are to this day some of my best friends. And I remember we would meet every week and we had this Bible study. And I remember one day I came in and I said, listen, we have a lot of conversations about things that don't matter, right? Like clothes and shoes and boys and all sorts of stuff. And what if once a week we had conversations about things that really did matter? Would that interest you? And would you come? And that first meeting, 6 girls showed up, and 6 meetings later, I had 347 girls showing up. So that was kind of my aha moment, that I wasn't the only one who was like starving for authenticity, for a safe place before safe spaces was ever like a word, but just this idea of what does it look like to come together with a group of incredibly diverse women, intentionally diverse, and for us to really be honest with each other and to support each other. And so that was kind of the moment that I was like, I'm not alone. Other girls want this too, and other girls need this as well.
And then you took it online.
You said as a brand and as a company, the next iteration was, how do we recruit more girls that aren't just in the tangible ecosystem of here at USC, but the idea that I didn't think USC was particularly unique per se, in that I felt like girls need girls, women need women. And so the next thought was like, of course, we're going to take this online and see if it resonates with other people. And before you know it, we have, 1.2 million people community who clearly are passionate about it.
How do you keep that message on brand across, or is it different? And is there flexibility? Did the mission grow out of all the women coming together in a different way?
I think no matter what, even as a founder of any kind of business or any kind of movement, organization, the vehicle doesn't really matter. I think a founder has a vision for something. And I think if you're a true founder, you have the humility to recognize that it's just a tapestry and everyone is a different color thread in that tapestry. And so for me, I think having the impetus and the spark for I Am That Girl, but truthfully, I mean, women have grabbed it and run with it. And created so much of their own thing. And I think that was a big part of kind of our pillars in it, where I am but one girl, originally from Texas. I have a very, very specific perspective to myself. We wanted every single girl, every single woman, every single person who identifies as female, we wanted all of them to be able to feel like it was a home. That's probably why, as a brand, back to kind of the business side of things, when you have a brand that has the flexibility and malleability hardwired into the DNA of the brand, I think that the longevity and the scalability is so much greater inherently, because people see themselves as a part of it, as opposed to having to mold to the brand. We mold to the individual.
So can you tell me about the squads?
Squads, I mean, we always say we're 21st century, a badass version of Girl Scouts for older girls, right? Because I was a Girl Scout and I'm a huge fan of Girl Scouts. And when we say badass, we just mean kind of an edgy taboo. We're going to talk about the hard, messy parts of life. And being a huge fan of the Girl Scouts and having been a Girl Scout, the idea was Girl Scouts end when you turn 18, when you graduate high school. And I Am That Girl picked up right where that ended, was just kind of this figuring out who you are in this world and creating your own voice and your own kind of unique identity.
You've become visible. You're the face of the organization. Even though it is about every other woman, you lead it. Was that a challenge? Or were you always the person who loved to be in front of the audience?
I think visibility is definitely a double-edged sword. And I think learning how to manage visibility, because I think the moment as a human, and I think it's something I've certainly struggled with over the years, because the expectations and quite frankly, the validation that exists outside of you. I think it's really easy to lose who you are in a world in which we are crowdsourcing confidence outside of ourselves. And I think visibility offers you that temptation of being like, oh, but all of these people have all of these ideas and all of these opinions, because that's really what visibility is, right? It's the mere recognition that people now have an opinion on your life, and often strangers have an opinion on their life. And because of social media, it's made those opinions directly communicated to you. And so I think there have been different moments in my life in which, I've kind of started becoming who I thought people wanted me to be, because all of a sudden this is resonating and people love this part of my personality. And I think you can get a little pigeonholed, and you can start living, like I said, kind of for the attention and the approval of others. And I think throughout my life, that temptation of having to reel it back in and having to be like, but who am I, regardless of, what other people want me to be? Who am I? What is my true north? What does my compass say? And visibility just creates a whole lot of distraction. So being able to navigate that, of staying authentic to who you are, kind of in the midst of the cameras and quite literally the stages that I'm on, figuring out how to kind of pull away from that and to have this quality time where I get to continue to reinvent myself, so that I'm not kind of this stale version of myself. Because it reminds me of a band, right? Every time a band has like an epic CD and everybody loves it and people come to the concert, they're like, I don't want to hear these new songs. I want to hear the old songs that I love. And I think visibility creates that. It's really easy for people to want you to stay where you are, because that's what they're comfortable with. And that forced personal growth, to me, has been the real challenge in the midst of it.
So 2 questions spring from that. The first is, do you have any practices, any spiritual practices that help you internal to your conversation? And then secondly, can you think of a time in your organization's growth when the external, the visible, the audience wanted you to go one way and you wanted to go another? And what did you decide? And how did you then lead them?
Oh gosh, girl. I mean, that's how I exist every day, are my spiritual practices, and kind of this idea of having my like really sacred routine that happens every morning. And I learned this from Gina Rudon, who had an incredible TED Talk, and she was talking about these sacred practices and this idea that everyone else can wait. And so in the morning, to me, that looks like meditation, that looks like prayer time, that looks like connecting with the God of my understanding. And getting quiet. I mean, more than anything, I would say, more than the doing, because I can be someone who's like, I'm going to journal because it feels very productive to me. Like, I'm going to sit down and write things. Much harder for me and my personality is just getting really quiet and really still. So in the mornings, I'll sit on my little yoga pad. I light my candle and I literally just sit there, even if I don't feel like it, for like minimum 20 minutes. And like I said, try to connect with my creator and just ask, what do you want of me today? By all means, infuse me. I think that's part of it. I think also human beings, I think, are like angels incarnate. And I'm really, really blessed by like the caliber of humans that I have in my life, both my friends, my family, my husband. That is sacred to me. Like that sacred circle of people that I choose to surround myself with and who love me back to life in the moments in which I totally forget who I am and or I'm having a meltdown for whatever reason. So I would say those are kind of my sacred practices, or just the people who remind me who I am and who I want to be. And quite frankly, who aren't yes people. That's really important to me. I don't want people who are just always telling me that I'm amazing. I want people who, when I'm getting astray and they pull me back lovingly, are like, hey, like my dad always says, like, you're getting too big for your britches, like someone who has the courage and the vulnerability to rumble, as Brene Brown would say. That's important to me. As far as kind of within the context of I Am That Girl, and this is like a very particular issue I'm very passionate about, because I don't think in the entrepreneurial world we talk about this enough. There's a great book called The E-Myth. And
Yeah.
it basically like outlines,
I know
right?
that
The
book. Yep.
idea that you're
Right.
like one of three things, but there's no way that you're a serial entrepreneur who also is this talent, who is this incredible vision, and you love managing people. And it really helps you get very specific about the thing that you love the most. And I think when I was starting I Am That Girl, my passion has always been people. It's always been in service of others, period. The idea that I could go into a room and that I could lecture at different conferences, but then that I could hug on all these girls and all these women, and like the real physical opportunity to be proximate to girls and women was the thing that lit me up. And I felt like at a certain point, people were like, I Am That Girl needs to be a business. It needs to be, this, and this, and you have to skill it. And and I fell into that trap when they talk about the woman in the book who loved to bake. And people kept saying, you're an incredible baker. You should start your own bakery. And, she kind of was like, okay, that's the thing. That's what everyone's saying I should do. And before you know it, she's, doing accounting, and she's doing hiring and firing and marketing. And all of a sudden she's not baking anymore. And she kind of has this meltdown and is like, but what I love is baking. I don't love, all this other stuff. And I think I had a real moment where everyone kept being like, you should do this. You should do this. And I took on a very CEO role. So all of a sudden I was in the minutia of all the details. I was overseeing all of our accounting and all of our legal and, all of the things, which by the way, a lot of people love that. Like a lot of people that Excel sheets drive them, whereas for me, I'm like,
please.
And yeah. And so all of a sudden I stopped doing all my speaking engagements. I stopped doing all the conferences. I stopped even meeting with all the girls, whether it was FaceTiming and being a part of their squads or whether it was showing up to chapter meetings. I stopped all of that and I started being a CEO. And I couldn't understand why I was so distraught. It's so miserable. I couldn't, and it wasn't until I read the E-Myth that I was like, like that story resonated so much with me of this female baker who all of a sudden was like, I just love to bake. And I had a real moment of, shifting gears within the leadership roles and saying, that minutia and those details don't interest me as much as being proximate to human beings. And if I am not able to at least have 50-50 to where I can be in the details, I can execute on things, I can create the vision, I can be a part of all those conversations. But if I don't have the real like tangible interaction with people, then I lose all my passion. And so that was a real awakening for me of like, oh, wow, even though this role feels impressive, what's more impressive is me being genuinely, filled with joy every day.
Do you think that women lead differently? And if yes, how?
I think that there's a difference between masculine energy and feminine energy. And I think that every human being poses kind of a combination of both of those. But I think from a leading with a femininity, which I think leadership requires both of it. And it's really up to each individual, I think, of what you lean into. I think for me, because I grew up with 4 older brothers, I grew up in a very masculine environment. I was an athlete. I worked at Fox Sports, ESPN. I've always been around a whole lot of men. I think that a lot of it is nature nurture. And that nurture aspect was I learned how to communicate very directly, which men predominantly communicate very directly. And I remember being 14 years old and having this kind of aha moment of that distinction when we talk about feminine, masculine energy. And I remember being in a room with like 5 of my brother's friends and the window was open and I was cold. And I remember like looking around and this is how a lot of women, how we're taught and programmed from a very young age, is this idea of getting consensus, which is a beautiful quality about feminine leadership, right? Is that we really, you talk about democracy, like we really want to hear, we want everyone heard and seen. And I remember looking around the room and being like, is anyone cold? And they're like, all the guys like look at me and they're like, what? And I'm like, I don't know. Are y'all cold? Do you want the window open? And I remember I'll never forget my brother's friend looking at me being like, are you cold? Do you want to shut the window? And I was like, oh, well, yeah. And he was like, then shut the window, And that was always like the perfect example between like men and women is like, oftentimes stereotypically speaking, when women have to go to the bathroom, we're like, does anyone have to go to the bathroom? Okay. And then we like go with our buddy. And like I said, I think it's a really beautiful characteristic of feminine leadership. And I think that I've had to learn and how to balance both of those, and that there are times to lean into one and times to lean into another.
And I'm pretty direct too, because as a producer, I'm just like, what? Let's get it done, right?
Yep.
But does that get you into trouble in scenarios with women at all?
It does. I think, like I said, I think it's an art, I think it is like a learning to lean into which arena, because there's some women that I made total assumptions about that. I was like, oh, I feel like she's just like hard, like badass. Like we use words to describe it that are like edgy and, and then in the middle of communicating with her, I could see that she was super sensitive. Right. And then I was like, oh gosh, like, and so to me, communication and leadership style, I think it takes a lot of humility, back to that word of like malleability, back to that word of flexibility, back to that word of almost this emotional intelligence to recognize that whoever is before you, whether it's a man, whether it's a woman, whether like, regardless of how they're dressed, regardless of how they're, coming across or what their job title is, I think so much of leadership is recognizing my only job is to take the time to learn how the human being in front of me needs to be communicated to. I learned that from Coach Pete Carroll, who was our football coach at USC, who really said, for me to be the best coach that I can be, I have to learn the style of every single one of my athletes to figure out how I can motivate them best. And for some of them, it's screaming profanities, finger in their face. For other ones, it's pulling them aside and being like, listen, man, you got to work harder. Right. I mean, and for every single one of them. So I think, and that's not dodging a question of whether I think women
I totally
and men
get it.
like communicate differently in leadership. It's more, I just think that it's one, finding your authentic style, which, like I said, being, growing up with so many men, I think my authentic style tends to be, I gravitate, my default setting is more of like a masculine leadership. And I've really had to learn how to include the feminine side of me as well. But yeah, I think it's a combination of like what authentically works for you and taking the time to figure out like what makes you tick. And then also taking the time to figure out how the person in front of you needs to be communicated with or to.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, for what cause or reason are you willing to be unpopular?
Oh, good question. I think that even back to that spiritual practice, I think that so much of kind of how I operate has always been in alignment with a truth that feels greater than me. So whether that's working with women in being maybe insatiably and inherently curious about like, how did we get here? I think that so much of my work starts with a question of like, has it always been this way? Have girls always been like really mean to each other in middle school years? Have we always felt threatened by each other? Have we always been this mean to ourselves? I think those were a lot of the initial questions that sparked I Am That Girl. And it was just like, how do we have dialogue around this? How do we, am I the only one wondering this? Am I the only one, feeling these, like beating myself up all the time? And am I alone in that? It's always begun with a very almost innocent question, like again, just kind of spawning from curiosity. And then I feel like that curiosity then becomes conviction, right? Gets like kind of translated into conviction as I believe that whole idea of like, we are taught so much and we can unlearn so much, and we can kind of, this idea within technology, like we're always like upgrading, with our technology. Are we upgrading within our humanity? And so like, those are the things that like keep me up at night, are the kind of the bigger questions around women, around violence against women. I always say you can't have a conversation about violence against women and not talk about Black Lives Matter, and not talk about the treatment of the LGBTQ community, and kind of this intersectionality of like, how do we all become better human beings? And what does that look like, of wanting to push culture forward and challenge it, to say the least. I think I'm inherently defiant. So I'm kind of like, does it have to be this way? Could we change it? What does change look like? How do we, how do we do that?
Yeah, I agree. I think that the culture seems to have intensified, because when you're asking the question, has it always been like this? Have girls always been this mean? And I think there is a new level of it because of the false projection of social media, because of the visibility, because of, I look at the underused definition of visibility when I'm working with people, and that's available. So it's, what are you available for? And if you are not available to reveal yourself or be yourself, then visibility is going to look very different. And then the conversations and the perceptions that you, as you said, people just make, and then they have direct contact with you before actually doing any internal exploration. Now, there's some broader question that is been trickling in my mind with you, because when I was doing the research, and I want to talk about ProtectHer now, you do so much work with men, young men, and young sportsmen who, quite frankly, they terrify me. I'm an arty girl. Like, what I love about your story is what I've, watched you speak, is that you talk about good men. You have 4 brothers, you grew up with good men. And I thought to myself, gosh, I did not grow up with good men.
Sure.
I can honestly say that. And one of my favorite clients ever, her too, with good men. And she's just this lovely, generous. And I'm wondering if there's something, and gosh, I hope this question comes out the right way, but that sets you up to have better conversations or to deal with this culture in a way that makes you feel less like an outsider if you come from being respected by men, because it's been so male dominated.
Sure.
And I hope that doesn't sound like an anti-feminist question, because I'm such a feminist. But what I'm trying to say is there is something I've noticed about the women in my life who say the men in my life are good men. There is, I think maybe it is that protection. They feel protected. There is a sense of ease with them that I can only, assume comes from that support.
Yeah, I mean, again, I can only speak from my perspective, but because I had an incredible father, and I remember someone told me this once, and I have no idea where it was sourced from. So it's certainly a fact check that needs to happen. But they told me that predominant male figure in a person's life, so whether it's biological or not, is responsible for 80% of a child's confidence. Ooh, and I thought that was really interesting.
That's
and
interesting.
They said, and the predominant female in that child's life is responsible for 80% of the child's empathy. And again, I don't remember, they came up to me after a talk and shared this with me. So I have no idea where they got that from, but it always resonated. Just this idea of, I wonder about that, because I grew up with an incredible father who was front and center for who coached me all through soccer, who was front and center for everything that, in addition to that, had these 4 incredible brothers. And all my best friends growing up were guys, because again, like that's what I was comfortable with. And I've found that not only in business do I just feel so comfortable, I arguably more comfortable in a room full of men than I ever felt in a room full of women.
Yeah.
Every like house in high school is like the house where everyone goes. And I would come walking in and there'd be like 10 of my brother's friends in our living room. And I'd be like, are any of my brothers here? And they'd be like, no, practice so-and-so. And it was always me in the proverbial, but what also felt like a very literal locker room. Like that's what, and listening to the way that they talked about girls, especially, but also just listening to the way in which they communicated. And so if anything, there became kind of an irony that I started this like women's empowerment company, because all my guy friends were like, you're such a tomboy. How are you running a women's empowerment, company? So I certainly know for my life experience that my expectation for men, and maybe it's a self-fulfilled prophecy, my expectation are that men are respectful, that they are kind, and that they're absolutely championing me. Like that is all that I know when I come into an environment, is like, of course you respect me. Of course you're going to treat me well. And I think also my tolerance for any kind of disrespect is 0. And it's always been that way. And I remember being in like in a bar in college, and a guy coming up and like being disrespectful to me, being like literally not even responding, because that didn't even like register on my radar. My dad used to always say, you have to teach people how to treat you. And it's amazing how many times, especially working in Fox Sports, ESPN, that environment, right? Of how many times I heard offhanded things that were disrespectful or whatever, and just how quickly, and back to that, communicating very directly, there's no passive aggressive here. And my husband always jokes to this day, and he was a professional athlete for 9 years. And he always says, the greatest luxury you ever gave me is I never have to wonder how you feel, right? Like if you're upset, I'm going to be the first person who knows, like there's no, or how are you, me saying fine, right? It's always like, no, I didn't like when you did X, Y, and Z. And it's incredible how quickly people can respond to that when they realize those jokes aren't funny. I'm not laughing. It was interesting because when I was running, I'm That Girl, did that for a whole lot of years. And I joked that like I keynoted every single women's conference. What I found was we were having a lot of conversations happening in silos. ESPN, Trent Dilfer, Yogi Roth, 2 really good friends, called and they said, hey, we have this thing called Elite 11. Will you come and, talk to the top 18 quarterbacks in the country on the importance of respecting women? And I remember at the time being like, it was totally one of those moments where you're like, I'm not prepared. Like women have an instinct to be like, I'm not prepared. I don't have enough time. And I remember it was one of the first times I just said yes. Like I said yes, even though I didn't have enough time. I wasn't prepared, all these things.
You had a lifetime of preparation. Come on. You were in the locker room. I was like, this is literal locker room translation.
But for totally different reasons, you know, and all of a sudden, and you know, ESPN was filming, it was like all these things, like the stakes were so high of like, I could fail on like a very big scale, you know, like that's all I was thinking was like, I've been talking to women, like, I don't know this demographic and I haven't spoken and I don't have a presentation. And then ended up being the whole backstory that most people don't know is like flights ended up getting changed around. The schedule gets changed. I'm told that I'm speaking at 4 p.m. And all I'm thinking was like, at least I'll have the day to put together a presentation because I had no slides. I had no concept of what I was going to talk about. And flight gets delayed. I don't get in until midnight. I, turn on my phone to have them saying, actually, we changed the schedule around. I hope you don't mind. You're actually speaking at 7 o'clock in the morning now, not at 4 p.m. Hair and makeup starts at, 6. And Trent wants to meet with you at like 5:30 to discuss what you're talking about. And I am hysterical. Like I called my husband. I was like, I'm going to fake an injury. Like I have no presentation. It's midnight. I'm not even in my hotel yet. I have to be up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Like this is going to be the worst. And it was my husband who had this awesome suggestion, which was exactly what you said. He was like, sweetheart, you're built for this. Like this is your life's work. And now you get to go back in locker rooms, not doing injury reports, which is a lot of the reason why I left the sports world was like my heart was really for girls and women. And he said, now you're getting this invitation to like bridge the gap between the two loves of your life. And he said, and at the end of the day, like if you speak from your heart, like that's all that matters. And he said, and by the way, do you know who's going to be in the room? And I said, of course, they gave me a list of, all the athletes. And he was the one who suggested, he was like, well, I would pull pictures of their sisters and moms and girlfriends. I'd put it in your presentation. Mm-hmm. And I was like, what? I was like, that feels a little sketchy. And he was like, yeah,
just do it.
Right. And that is literally, I pulled pictures of sisters, moms, girlfriends. I went in, I said, listen, we're going to have a conversation about the importance of, respecting women. And of course you have all these athletes who are like, I've heard this talk 1,000 different ways. Like we're the bad guys, so they're already kind of tuning out. I pulled up pictures and I memorized the names of their sisters and moms and girlfriends. And I said, it's really different when it's her. And I clicked the next slide and all of a sudden you saw these guys being like, just like one, it's just completely sketchy that you have a stranger who now you're looking at a picture of your like little sister, But I think the thing I wasn't prepared for was just the emotional reaction that these young men had to this, that suddenly we weren't talking about girls and women in theory. We were talking about the girls and women that they loved and they cared about the very most in the whole world. And I was inviting them to stand up on behalf of those women. And then back to that criticism, and I've certainly been criticized by, well, they should respect all girls and all women shouldn't just be their, sisters and moms. And I'm like, I don't disagree. We're just not there yet.
Got to start somewhere.
You got to start somewhere. And if this is a technique or a tactic, that gets them to feel something that makes it immediately personal, maybe that's just a stepping stone and that's okay. And then they came out to me after and were like hugging me and very emotional and in tears. And I was like, what? And I was thinking it's this like favor to a friend. And then a little snippet ended up going viral. And it was like, felt like overnight I was hired by Division I locker rooms all over the country saying, can you come into our locker room? Can you have that conversation? Because it wasn't from an angry pointing fingers, blaming, shaming standpoint. It was, I started off saying, I think you're real life superheroes. I think the whole country is talking about you like you're the problem. And I also think you're the cure. And this is why I think you're protectors at heart. I think it's how you're hardwired. I think that you're built for this. And we've never needed you as much as we need you right now. And it's incredible to see the reaction when you invite someone to participate in something as opposed to telling them that they're the problem and they're the reason that, this problem exists.
This year when Kobe Bryant passed, and I'm not a sportswoman, but that shook me in such a profound way, him and his daughter. And then the sort of the conversation that started from actually some friends of friends about, well, he raped a woman. I just kind of thought to myself, when do we have the conversation about forgiveness? And I'm probably an unlikely person to have this conversation because I do often go down hard on that kind of behavior. But in that case, there was such an effort to reform, to heal, to have the conversation so how do we even broach the conversation of forgiveness with women
Yep.
Because I think, and I think that has to be part of it.
Sure.
I think that has to be part of it. And I'm not, this is not making it right, because there's nothing right with that at all.
Of course.
But I think otherwise, what's the motivation to change if there's no forgiveness for these men who do F it up? Right? Yep, because the culture sets them up, quite frankly. Here, you're 18. 1000%. Here's some power. Here's some money. The world is going to love you. You can do whatever you want. Right? Mm-hmm. And I know, but even in entertainment, there are lots of people who enable the kind of behavior.
Of course.
Right?
I think that, like you said, it's two sides of the same coin if we're ever going to get to a place of actual change. And one is addressing, acknowledging, listening to the righteous indignation and anger. There's righteous anger that if you're a woman in America today and you see the things that are happening, and not even just a woman, if you are a person who is looking at statistics of 1 in 4, 1 in 5 girls will be sexually assaulted on a college campus, 1 in 2 women walk around having been sexually assaulted in her lifetime. Like, if we don't all have a low grade fever out of like a mild rage that exists all the time, then we're not living and breathing. And again, that's just with women. And so I think when we look at social change, we have to make space, which I think is very much happening in this moment right now with Black Lives Matters. We have not made space in order to hear the righteous indignation and anger that is so tangible and real, right? And one, acknowledging that, listening to that, seeing that, honoring that they're very real, raw wounds that exist. And simultaneously, the only way forward is by having really radical conversations, like things like grace and things like forgiveness and things like rehabilitation. And what's hard is when someone is in so much pain, right? Because again, this criticism, right? When people just like fling things at me and they're like, you're a rape sympathizer. And I'm like, whoa. Like, not the case, right? But I also, do I understand where that pain is coming from? Yes, I totally understand where that's coming from. But again, it's like, my dad used to always say, the idea that we can experience pain and we should experience the entire gamut of all of the human emotions. But if we sit there for too long, that can become dangerous, right? Because then our life becomes defined by our pain, by our suffering. And so I think we have to acknowledge it and really sit there in the silence with survivors for as long as they need, and not but. And I think in order to get to the other side of it, we have to, like you said, start incentivizing, right? By saying, listen, we're really imperfect, messy human beings. And we are neither our worst mistake nor our greatest achievement. And so if we can offer grace in those moments and say like, wow, this is someone who made really bad mistakes and with very serious consequences and was very damaging to another human being, to other people. That being said, like, they've spent a lifetime reforming and they've spent a lifetime learning how to become an incredible husband, how to become an incredible father. And so it was interesting because when I did a post about Kobe, my first day on the job was his 81-point game in Los Angeles at the Staples Center. And my husband, being a professional basketball player, looked up to Kobe for so many reasons. And when I did a post about Kobe saying like, for this family, like my heart goes out to this wife and to these daughters, like a husband and a father was lost. And immediately, and social media is such a coward's favorite hiding place, right? Because immediately was like, how can you say that? He raped someone. And I was like, first off, where's the grace in this moment that there's some little girls out there who lost their daddy? Like, where's that also, right? The whole concept, Richard Rohr is one of my favorite authors. He wrote a book called Everything Belongs, right? That we can be messy and we can be mean and we can make mistakes and we can have like a miraculous, piece of us that is like God breathed, and all of it belongs. I think the bravest, most courageous conversations that we can be having right now in the midst of Me Too and Time's Up is, what does progress look like? What does moving forward look like? And I do think that is having really brave conversation around things like forgiveness and things like rehabilitation. And, how are we better educating again? How are we working with young men to help them unlearn and to stop reading off a cultural script they've been handed, which, this idea of toxic masculinity is damaging to all of us. It's not just to women. It's damaging. The cost is so great.
know you spent some time as a consultant on 13 Reasons Why, which I think should be required viewing for teenagers, because I was watching it and also realizing the level of complexity, like looking back going, gosh, to your point, was it this hard back at that time? And it just wasn't. Like, yes, those things were going on, but now everybody sees them.
Sure.
So that rumor has a video attached to it about what she did or didn't do. So tell me how you became involved with that show.
Yeah. I mean, I think that one thing I'm really proud of in that show was just the like unflinching willingness to really give us a vehicle, give us Hollywood fictional characters to talk about the things that are really happening. And whether it's teen suicide or whether it's sexual assault, I think that so many people got so passionately upset about that. And what I was saying, my kind of reaction as an activist is like, oh, yes, again, like I want you to get agitated. I want you to get upset. But I don't want you to get upset at like a Hollywood fictional, like actors being paid very well to like fake these scenes. I want you to be upset that this is happening in high schools everywhere all over the country. And this is just giving us a vehicle to talk about the stuff that is really happening. And there was a moment where Bryce's character and the guy who was playing him, who is such a lovely human being. And so part of it is like just the irony that I'm like, you're so kind and lovely and you're playing.
God, I hated him in that show. Oh my God, he was awful. I just can't even, because you know him, because you know that character, you know him. And I was just like, every time I saw his face. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and Justin, who plays Bryce, like I said, is such an incredibly talented storyteller, right? To make any of us hate that character as much as we did makes him an incredibly talented storyteller. But when he and I were sitting there kind of wrestling with the script and going back and forth, and he was saying, my character, like he's a monster, he's, all these things. And I really hit pause and I said, can I offer you a suggestion? Can I offer you the suggestion of not playing him as this kind of psychopath monster, but as an ordinary kid who has been told and taught a level of privilege that now transcends to human. Like you get what you want when you want because you want it, right? And can you come up with memories? And this is so much of like an actor's job, right? Create these memories for your character in which your dad told you that. You take what you want, And I was like, so instead of playing him as a monster, play him. He's so relatable. There's so many men who have that paradigm. And the reality is it's an incredibly dangerous paradigm when you don't realize that you can't take when what you're taking is a human, especially when there's no consent present. And I just thought Justin was so brave to play that character from a place of privilege, not turning him into this kind of unrelatable person, but instead saying this happens, unfortunately, so often. So how do we let even young men see themselves, aspects of themselves in this character, and really have a gut check of like, whoa, that's actually not cool.
Yeah. And this privilege conversation obviously comes into Black Lives Matter too. And this whole conversation, we need to talk to our kids about the police. And I'm thinking we need to talk to young white men about privilege. Yep. That's what we really need to have the conversation about. Somebody needs to be leading that conversation too. Yeah. And I feel like you are. I feel like as a woman you are in coming at it from sports, which in this culture is one of the beginning of where that privilege begins.
I always say the reason that we started ProtectHer in locker rooms is that, athletes are the 21st century gladiators. Right? I mean, they are kind of the way that we put them on these pedestals, the way that we have created a concept of masculinity is like the biggest, fastest, strongest, And I was watching the documentary by Jennifer Newsom, and it's called The Masks We Live In, and it's incredible. And it's the counterpart.
This is the first one. Yep.
Yeah, it's the counterpart, the male counterpart to Misrepresentation, which was her first documentary. And in it, at one point, my husband, who is 6'9", right, this huge man, he hit pause. And he like looks at me and he's like tears. And I was like, oh my God, babe, what are you crying? And he's very tenderhearted and he cries at the drop of a hat. And like at our wedding, I got to the end of the aisle and he was like hyperventilating, crying so hard that I was like, man, get it together, And so he was very emotional and he hits pause and he looks at me, and it was during one of the testimonials when one of the men was saying that when he was younger, he was bullied because he was, more effeminate and not as kind of like traditionally masculine. And Brad just looked at me and he said, had I not just been like in this avatar body. He was like, I've always been the biggest. I've always been the best athlete. I've always been all these things, but he is so gentle and he is so kind and he's so sensitive. And he was like, had I not just been this incredible athlete, like I would have totally been bullied. Like I did not ascribe to like any of the stuff that like all these other guys were doing, the way they talked about women, the like random hookups, like all the things that are very part of that kind of like jock culture. He was like, that wasn't who I was. And he was really emotional about that, of like the only reason why I wasn't targeted and bullied was because I just happened to be this incredible athlete. And so I think when we look at kind of the trend setters and the influencers within the male space, so many athletes, or who like the little boys are looking up to. And so what we found was identifying those locker rooms and creating a new normal, a new standard, a new expectation of what it means to be, again, kind of a 21st century man who like boys will be boys as long as they're always respecting women, like kind of these new adage, bro code, all day, like love, support, defend each other, but not at the expense of other people, and that idea of like, can you inject into this new concept of bro code is I'm going to hold you accountable to being a really good human. That's what, like to me, it's kind of this evolution because there's a lot of really good about bro code, right? About that brotherhood. Mm-hmm. It just becomes really sinister when it becomes complete greasing of the wheels and utter lack of accountability. And so I think it's just kind of bolstering it with like their new expectations and how incredible that we are seeing this moment in time in which we are being so directly confronted with Me Too and Black Lives Matters and like these movements, like really showcasing like how severe the problem is so that we can start being forced into conversations about solutions.
Sounds like men need the voice lessons too. They're holding space sometimes in silence for what other men do because they don't want to appear less masculine.
Sure. Yeah.
They don't speak up because they don't want to break what is the rule to be a man.
Yep. Exactly. And I think that so much of that is invisible, just like privilege, right? So much of like bro code is this invisible thing that they don't even necessarily have the vernacular or words to identify. They just know in a moment where something sketchy is going down, they don't say anything. And so I think part of it is like preparing them for those situations.
Yes, for those conversations.
And part of it is like speaking truth and making this invisible system visible. And I mean, that's what we're talking about with privilege, right? This invisible system that I've benefited from my entire life has to be made visible, both to myself and to everyone else, in order for us to see like, my God, this isn't fair. Not only is this not fair, this is a travesty and it has to be changed. Every time that I've come into locker rooms and had these very practical conversations with young men about, let me make this invisible structure visible for you. And you tell me if you agree with this, all of a sudden you see them being like, no, that's not okay. Like, give me the words. What do I say in those moments, when I see something? Because even that, men aren't nearly from a very young age as verbal as women are. They're not taught to be as verbal. And so I can't tell you how many guys have come up to me after and been like, oh my gosh, I just never even had. And I always say the line like, hey, we're better than that, right? Like, we don't do that, right? Just that, like a phrase that they have in their back pocket. And then how many people have like contacted me on social media or emailed me or somehow been like, oh my God, I used it. I used the line. This was happening, and there were these homophobic jokes. And I told them like, we don't do that, man. And all of a sudden, like, we don't realize like the practicality of language and like the power of language when you give people the actual words instead of saying like, I always joke in my TED talk around like bystander and intervention, like none of these young men are talking that way. No. So can you give them actual tools in that moment and prepare them? It's not if, it is when you see something that's not cool. Now you know what to say. And it's shocking how many guys have been so proud to like report back,
I love it. If I asked you to complete the sentence, my wish for every other woman is?
My wish for every woman is that she had an undeniable true north of exactly who she is and was unapologetic about pursuing that.
Beautiful. What about your wish for every man?
My wish for every man is that he had a true north and that he was unapologetic about it. and that he knew and loved himself as much as we put them on pedestals, that could be authentic for him.
You have all of the answers when you ask the right questions. Be visible. Speak your truth. Every other woman needs you to lead.